Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna-Marie, for such a wonderful introduction. It's one of those days where you're happy that things are being recorded, right? So you get to listen to the introduction that you just gave. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm in particular very happy to be with such an interdisciplinary crowd as you all come from different areas and different areas of expertise. And as already noted by Anna-Marie, what I'll talk about is the ice age of reproduction, and it became quite apparent to me in preparing these notes the last few days that the notion of ice and sort of the preoccupation with ice in the Western imaginary at least seems to be abundant in any number of places. And just to show you a few of these places, a few of them are listed here: ovarian tissue preservation samples, for instance, at the reproductive laboratory at Copenhagen University, that get extracted from women that are undergoing or about to undergo chemotherapy or another serious type of treatment, have their ovarian tissue extracted and then frozen and in cryopreservation tanks for however long it takes till they're able to perhaps reuse and have the tissue transplanted. If you work with this kind of topic, you end up spending quite a bit of time with these sexy looking cryotanks. And I am interested in the ways in which cryopreservation is imagined in, sort of culturally speaking, including the role of these particular tanks. And I'll talk more about that. You also become aware of the fact that cryopreservation seems to sort of play on our imaginaries of immortality, such as in the case of cryonics, the idea of cheating death. And if you look at cryonics rhetoric, such as what I enjoy doing, you will be able to see how the notion of freezing a patience, that is to postpone the death or to reverse death, becomes one of the prominent imaginaries in this particular setting. And of course, this is at the same time what these notion of the ice that is thawing is being sort of predominant in the imaginary as well, with these sorts of doomsday narratives, such as this title here from 2017. There are diseases hidden in ice and they are waking up. It does sound a bit like maybe a thriller or some sort of movie that would be entertaining us in how this is a doomsday narrative for humankind. So in the midst of these sorts of venues, various kinds of cryo-commercial practices open up, such as this one, Perpetuate, where my beloved dog Coco perhaps can get a second life. That is, where you can extract out DNA and later freeze it, and later conduct cloning, and you may be able to have your beloved dog at a price of about $100,000, or a cat is only $50,000, animated later on after its death, or perhaps during its lifetime even. So what I want to do today is to return to some of these various images, and I want to do two things. I want to present to you what a cultural analytical framework does and what it can do. That is, how do people like me work with this sorts of material? What are our sort of venues into these more health or natural science topics? And I want to do that, of course, by showing you three examples, and the three examples are coming out of articles that I have written either alone or with some of the postdocs in the Ice Age project. And the three examples include gamete freezing, that is the freezing of reproductive cells, both egg and sperm cells. They include the PET preservation aspect, which is the one that I just showed you about preserving PET's DNA for later cloning and reanimation. And they include ovarian tissue freezing, that is observations, interviews, scientific articles on ovarian tissue freezing. So we'll look at these three, not necessarily tied in projects, and see what a cultural analytical framework can do with that. And then, of course, you can be the judge as to how and what this framework can bring to scientific scholarship. But first of all, when you're looking at these sorts of topics from a cultural analytical point of view, you're often asking yourself this question: That is, how is cryopreservation and banking animated in commercial, aesthetic, and scientific accounts? And when I use this notion of animated, I'm drawing upon cultural, analytical ideas about animacy. That is, animacy being something we do rhetorically, linguistically, discursively, but also the notion that we animate in ways that make certain species or certain types more valuable than other types. So that with the notion of animacy is also the idea of ideological hierarchies. That is, that some types of preservation and some preserved objects become more valuable than other objects. So I'm looking at these three different accounts. That's sort of my empirical material. It's often the commercial accounts, the aesthetic accounts, and the scientific accounts. And in getting this material, I'll talk about how I methodologically approach it, and often it may be through visual analyses, it may be through interviews, it may be through observational studies, and so forth. But again, a thread throughout the material is the idea that rhetoric or discourse does something. That is, how we talk about a preservation technology also is key to understanding how we conceptualize the technology. And more than that, I would argue from a cultural analytical point of view, it's key to understanding what we consider right, wrong, and nature. That is, in much of the material that I'm looking at, the notion of nature picks up. And nature becomes often connected or entangled with ideas of what's morally right and morally wrong. So let's look at a few of these different examples. And what we'll do first is that we'll look at a few examples of gamete freezing, and then I'll talk a bit about how you might approach that from a cultural analytical point of view. And do take notes in case you have things you would like to add and ask about, etc. So as part of my research, I have had the pleasure of looking into elective egg freezing. Elective egg freezing is not so common in Denmark, in part because of our legal structure, which means that you can cryopreserve eggs electively up to 5 years. But in the United States, and one might say, of course, it's become a huge commercial practice. In fact, some of the clinics I work with will say that a third of their business deals with elective egg freezing. And mind you, this is not an inexpensive practice, right? It's a practice that costs about, in the US, around $10,000. There is a banking fee that one has to pay of about $500. And there is a success rate of returning back using the frozen and now thawed oocytes of about 2 to 12%. So it's a lot of money for very little, one might say. But nevertheless, it's a burgeoning practice, commercial practice. And this is one of the latest companies that has begun sort of featuring its the possibilities within New York City. So I've looked at 3 clinics: New York University, the Langone Health Center, Extend Fertility, where I've been observing various practices at New York. I was doing interviews with women that froze their oocytes, and then this one that I've done more sort of an aesthetic sort of approach to. This is the latest of them all, and it's an interesting take as it's redefining egg freezing to something that's almost a part of a wellness or spa sort of feeling. Options now, possibilities later. Let's take a quick look at Extend's way of presenting egg freezing.
Life. There seems to be some sort of plan already in place. It's like someone says, go, and we're expected to start getting our ducks in a row for the ultimate event, having a baby, which you definitely want, or might want, or haven't really thought about yet because life. Yet, somehow over time, all those expectations put on you become expectations you put on yourself. And you're like, wait, what? Because this wasn't even your plan to begin with. But if a baby is a maybe, there is still one very real issue to contend with, and that's time. When women just get more amazing with time, Our eggs have not gotten with the program. Eggs age over time. Their genetic material degrades, making a healthy pregnancy tough. Plus, we're born with all the eggs we'll ever have. And over time, we lose them. That makes our 20s and early 30s the best time to have kids. So, does that mean we need to drop what we're doing and find a baby daddy stat? That would be negatory. Though we can't stop ourselves from getting older, we can now stop our eggs from aging. How? By putting them on ice. Because when you freeze your eggs, you freeze their age forever. This means 40-year-old you has the option of having a baby using eggs from 27-year-old spring chicken you. And having options is what it's all about. So, here's a new one. Extend Fertility, the first service in the U.S. focused exclusively on women who want to freeze their eggs. Unlike at infertility clinics, catering mostly to couples ready for babies now, you'll be among like-minded women, taking control of their fertility and their future, at a price that makes sense at this point in your life. Times are different. Women have tons more opportunity and directions we can take our lives in. When you preserve your eggs, you preserve your options, and you make the plan all yours.
Now, I'm sure there could be a lot said about this commercial. Just very briefly, I'm quite taken with the clocks that are just kind of ticking and very clearly sending a message that time is running out. And if you look at it from a cultural analytical point of view, you would notice that the clock actually has taken on a rather significant role in contemporary culture. And we might even think about this as a way of conceptualizing what we do in terms of time, in terms of economic time, in terms of capital time, and in this commercial we would say in terms of optimal time for reproduction and the idea of having a child. Now, you might think as the audience that, well, that's fine. The women, of course, need to preserve their oocytes as they are running out of time. Everyone knows this. How about the men? Well, I mean, rest assured that there's always a market for all kinds of gametes and reproductive cells. This is, as far as I know, the leading clinic at the moment, Legacy. It's located in Geneva in Switzerland. It's hooked up to Cambridge in Massachusetts, providing men with opportunities to preserve what is here written within an economic model, right, their assets. So let's look at these two together and what a cultural analytical framework very briefly might be able to offer you. Well, first of all, of course, we would know who are these people that are being, I mean, how is this particular commercial and visual presentation trying to be persuasive? I mean, what is it that it's doing to persuade us to think about oocyte or sperm freezing electively as a rather good investment, right? Well, it's doing it by, in a sense, communicating or discursively writing the idea of freezing as exactly an investment in the future, as a way of preserving one's options, and it's doing that by drawing upon a rather neoliberal ideology of individuals as being individually responsible for securing their reproductive abilities. And that's interesting, given the fact that we might say, well, the welfare state might be actually where it's at, and the welfare state should protect our abilities to become parents. Here it's a very economic neoliberal model of parenthood. And then it's doing it by driving this notion of investment as being something that's related to reproduction. And it's doing it by rhetorically creating a notion of the responsible reproductive citizen is the one that anticipates, if nothing else, anticipates future infertility, right? So we've gone from the notion of treating infertility to bio-anticipating future infertility, and thus the idea of securing one's assets as a way of enacting, performing responsible reproductive citizenship. I would argue it would be one of the ways, and of course here written within this attractive, younger, white sort of image as well. Okay, having said that, let's go on to my pets, which is one of the, I think one of the most fun articles that I have written on. The project got started in several ways, but some of you may recognize this, although perhaps this is not what you spend your time on, but Barbara Streisand's dog Samantha died. It was incredibly devastating. Barbara Streisand was incredibly connected to Samantha. This is her tombstone. And before she died, she just managed to send to Viagen Pets tissue samples of Samantha. And here are Samantha's clones visiting Samantha's grave. So it was a big success story. Now maybe all of us could get some Barbara Streisand's dog, potentially one might say. And I was interested in it because I thought it was such a strange, fun topic. I was at the time in Massachusetts, where Perpetuate, the clinic you saw before, has their main office. And so I decided to look more into the material by looking at the ways it's being advertised, by looking at all the testimonials I could find about pet preservation, and seeing how do people who do it talk about preserving their pets. And then I was also looking at it in line of consumer culture, which I think pet preservation readily can be written into, right? And this whole argument that our pets are increasingly becoming like our children, and like our children, they should not be missing anything. So we have the clothing, we have various kinds of pet spas in the US, of course, New York City. We have pet surveillance, so that when we're all in our offices, we can see what the dog is really doing. We have pet hotels, and of course, veterinarians and so forth. In Copenhagen, there are pet classes for what to expect when you're expecting, and that's for individuals that are waiting to get a puppy. So it's a bit like a maternity-paternity class to reorient themselves to what to expect when they're expecting. So I looked into this using this visual and written material, and I look, for instance, at images like this one that describes the process, and I'll show you a brief video and then say a bit more about what a cultural analytical framework can do. So,
at Viagen Pets, we know lots of people have questions about genetic preservation and cloning of their beloved dog or cat. So let's meet the Anderson family and their pet, Buddy. Buddy is a smart, playful 12-year-old golden retriever. The Andersons consider Buddy to be an irreplaceable member of the family. As Buddy got older, the Andersons decided to preserve Buddy's genes. Their vet performed a small tissue biopsy, a minor procedure for Buddy, and sent the sample to Viagen for genetic preservation. We cultured new living cells from the sample, and then the cells were frozen for preservation. So the Andersons were comforted to know they had the option to clone their pet should they choose to do so. Today, the Andersons decided to clone Buddy. To begin, we'll take one of Buddy's cells and replace the nucleus of a female dog's egg. After treatment by our patented process, the egg and cell join together and the embryo starts to grow. Soon, the embryo is transferred to a surrogate mother, who, after a typical gestation, will give birth to Buddy 2. Buddy's clone. None of Buddy's genes were changed, so Buddy 2 is really like Buddy's identical twin brother, just born at a later time. Buddy 2 will be as healthy as Buddy was as a puppy, and most likely will also be smart, playful, and look like Buddy as well. And with the Andersons' love, he'll grow and thrive. To learn more about dog and cat cloning, please visit us at viagenpets.com.
now you're all going to go back to this particular description probably to see what's needed. Let's see here. There we go. Let me just get back to it here. Okay, this is the one I just wanted to look at again, because if you look at it from this cultural analytical point of view, and you've seen the video now, you'll see that this is the perfect white nuclear family, perfectly gender sex balance between seemingly two children, one boy, one girl, sitting with one dad and one mother. And interestingly enough, they're in black and white, and body 1 and body 2 are the only that are sort of visualized as being so-called real. Perhaps in that sense communicating the idea too that this could be any family that could be on the receiving end of body, not just body 1, but also body 2. Clearly, the dog here is written into a kinship structure, right? I mean, this is a kinning with animals that goes beyond the idea that you have a guard dog or just a dog. Body is being anthropomorphized in these images. Body is graduating, body is getting older, body is turning 12, and body 2 is becoming the perfect replica of body 1. In that sense, genetic or tissue freezing becomes a promissory substance, right? That freezing becomes articulated as an opportunity to reanimate the same perfect family in the future. And from a more critical theoretical point of view, we might say what types of animals are being positioned as being worthy of reanimating, what animals are not, what types of structures are being reiterated in these sorts of images. Now moving on to my third example here, and the very last one, I'll look at ovarian tissue freezing, which is a project that I'm doing together with Anna-Sophie Bach. You'll see a photo of her in a bit, where we're looking at the ways in which ovarian tissue freezing is talked about, is also imagined by the scientific community. So what we've done is that we've spent time at the reproductive laboratory in Copenhagen connected to Rigshospitalet. We've spent time with the biologists and the lab technicians that are basically receiving the ovarian tissue when it comes from various places in Denmark, is brought to the lab, is cut into smaller pieces, and is then frozen. We've looked at the scientific journal articles. We've gone to scientific conferences to hear more about the ways in which ovarian tissue freezing, we argue, sort of entangles with the idea of hope and future fertility. Because, as I mentioned briefly, the idea is that the frozen tissue can be thawed and retransplanted into the woman herself. And then we'll look at this image here in a bit as well. But in doing that work, we have narrowed it down to 3 different imaginaries we're arguing that the scientific discourses seem to be drawing upon. The first one here is a brave new world of possibility. And this is not uncommon for scientific discourses, but this is just one example here. After ovarian transplantation, all patients were able to attempt natural conception every month without medical assistance. In fact, the commonly held view that egg freezing is a proven technique and ovary tissue transplantation is so-called experimental is belied by the fact that most of the successful pregnancies resulting from fertility preservation in cancer patients thus far have been from frozen ovary tissue, and few at the date of this writing have come from frozen oocytes. So the scientific discourse, if you look at the articles and the time spent with the medical assistants, with the biologists, with the doctors, is very much written within this idea of a brave new world of possibility. In fact, ovarian tissue freezing was begun even before it was seen as being a potentially successful way to restore fertility. And currently the reproductive lab is able to freeze testicular tissue as the new sort of brave new world of possibility opens up. So that's one sort of imaginary that we're seeing in that material. The other imaginary is the idea of ovarian tissue freezing as a way of managing risk and hope. And here's one example. In several countries that offer ovarian tissue cryopreservation to patients, one of the inclusion criteria is that the women should be no more than 30 years old. In Denmark, there is no exact maximum age rather than an individual evaluation of the patient's reproductive age, which can differ from the patient's chronological age, although ovarian tissue cryopreservation is not offered to women above 35 years of age due to a diminished ovarian reserve. So there's a lot of debates in the scientific community about how to manage the risks associated with lower fertility rates, or perhaps losing one's fertility entirely. And here, ovarian tissue cryopreservation becomes a way of managing what is seen as the risk of infertility or future infertility. But it's also, and this example may not quite show it, also a way of managing hope. That is the idea that when frozen, or when cryopreserved rather, the ovarian tissue becomes a hopeful matter, a hope for the woman who has it in the cryotanks, as well as for the family at times, a hope for a future grandchild and so forth. And it also becomes, in that sense, a hope technology, which is talked about in the literature quite a bit. And then it becomes a romanticizing of natural fertility, or we might perhaps even say natural conception. So here the quote says, if successful, this technique could permit a woman to conceive naturally with her own eggs and to delay pregnancy until she's in a stable relationship. Furthermore, an ovarian graft provides a source of natural sex steroids in circumstances where hormone replacement therapy would otherwise be required. And this last one is perhaps the sort of new exciting imaginary, that is the imaginary associated with postponing menopause. This is an image taken from a scientific article written by two Danish scientists, in which the process is explained. And of course, as a cultural analyst, I love the images that they're using to portray them with. We see the younger woman, slim, white, so forth. We see the inside of her body, and we see the ovarian tissue here that has become cryopreserved. Naturally, in a way, with these sorts of arrows, going into becoming isolated follicles or ovarian cortical tissue that gets transplanted into this decidedly more middle-aged woman, a copy or the same woman now, however, with a small handbag, pearls, and shorter hair and glasses, welcoming, one might say, this ovarian tissue transplant. Now, in the imaginary, the idea of postponing menopause is seen as a resource-wise way of managing ovarian tissue. Because in the scientific imaginary, the idea of the health costs associated with menopausal women gets narrated or discursively sort of constructs this idea of menopause as being not only a health risk, but a health economic risk. So in the welfare state, the idea of postponing is written as being a rather attractive option. So these are three examples of some of the work that I am dealing with. I want to say a little bit here about the group, the team that's working with this, and the team is the one that received the funding from the Danish Research Fund of the Humanities. And it consists of Janne Rodmar Hermann, who's a professor in law at the law school in Copenhagen. Janne and I are looking at the legal frameworks for cryopreservation of fertility, and we're doing it from this combined legal, cultural, analytical framework. So we're basically arguing that when you look at law, you're looking at a text, you're looking at fiction in the making. That might not be what the lawyers would say, but you're looking at a piece of work that has been constructed, and in looking at the debates that have gone into the making of the law and the wording of the law, we can talk about some of the imaginaries that are associated with fertility and with cryopreservation. So just very briefly, one example would be the concern about cryopreserving for extended periods of time, where there were in the law, in the 2006 law debates, clearly sort of articulated this concern about putting the family in the freezer. And this was a term that was being used to basically write up the monstrosities concerned with the idea of freezing for longer periods of time. So that's Janne, who's over here on your left-hand side. Rune Klingenberg Hansen and Thomas Søbjerg Petersen are these two. They are at Roskilde University. Rune is postdoc in the project, and Thomas Søbjerg is professor in the project. They're both working within bioethics. And we wanted to have this more bioethical point of view represented, as many of these technologies are also being discussed from the perspectives of what's wrong, what's morally offensive, and so forth. Stine Willum Adrian is at Aalborg University. She's a techno-anthropologist. So she's interested in technologies being used and how the technologies are being understood by the clinicians, by the patients, etc. Michael Nebeling Petersen is here at our university, University of Southern Denmark. He's interested in how the parents or the individuals that have embryos are cryopreserved, how they think about these embryos. Sometimes some of the ones that he includes have embryos preserved in places outside of Denmark. And they may talk about these embryos as future siblings to their current children. So the argument being that this is not just matter that is on ice, or it's exactly not on ice because that would actually destroy the matter, but it's being cryopreserved. This is actually material that might be written into a kinship structure, such as a sibling. Anna Sophie is working with the ovarian tissue freezing and the menopause project, and I'm having the pleasure of being able to work across, but especially working on the oocyte preservation part. Now starting a project that includes Denmark and Sweden, where it's much more prevalent. So let me here towards the very end sum up a bit and discuss with you a little bit about sort of what the take-home message might be of looking at the ice age of reproduction and having had these three different examples. Well, one of the sort of obvious ones of looking at freezing technologies is what it does. I mean, what is it that freezing technologies does? What is it that makes it such an exciting technology to work with? One of them is that it's able to suspend the vitality to come, but it's able to engage in a freezing or in a storing, a preservation, and make material latent for the future. So it's able to do this sort of suspension at the same time as it also creates suspense and drama and various sorts of dilemmas, right? So it's doing that in interesting ways. It's also creating new questions for us in regard to the plasticity of living. So if we're able to preserve parts or wholes, perhaps parts of bodies or whole bodies, it questions the idea of life and death. It questions the idea of the past and the future. It creates new scenarios of what the future might look like, and it might also create new expectations, such as in the case of elective egg freezing, of what one should do with one's reproductive matter. In the interviews I did, it became clear that to some of the women, freezing their oocytes also became sort of a way of not only securing their fertility, but also taking pressure off in terms of dating. And it even translated into becoming a dating asset. That is, when one then would go out and meet someone, one could say that one had been wise enough to not only have a career and have graduated from an Ivy League university, but also have preserved one's reproductive assets for the right moment, for the right guy. And in that sense, freezing becomes a way of managing oneself in normative ways of ensuring future fertility. Why we say that cultural studies scholars can add to this picture, because one thing is what reproductive science scholars are doing, what cryobiologists perhaps are doing in terms of expanding the possibilities of what can be preserved and so forth. I think that what we're able to do is to look at the ways in which these technologies are translated culturally. That is, we're able to say the technologies may be developed, but in order for them to become part of a culture, we're able to point to and to delineate how these sorts of technologies become understood culturally, and the ways in which they draw upon recognizable understandings of what one should and should not do in a normative sort of manner. That is, how one should be able to interact with these technologies and how one should not. interestingly, I think a cultural studies scholar would also be able to point to the ways in which freezing technologies move between different disciplines. So moving from the notion of reproductive science or cryobiology to reproductive science, the animal sciences, to even the general cultural preoccupation with youth, with the idea of anti-aging, that is, for instance, with postponing menopause, or as in the case of cool sculpting, that is using cold temperatures to remove fat, that is to sort of translate it into these much more normative sorts of areas. So having given you some examples, having given you just a brief take-home message, I hope I've generated, if nothing else, just a desire to know more about the ice and frost. And thank you. I'm very much keen to hear what you have to say and what you ask. Thank you for the opportunity.